Yeah, it really helps you to come to terms with things, doesn't it?
Yeah, it gives you an appreciation of how desperate things are there.
That's exactly right. Well, I know you all had sort of a run through. Mercedes has briefed me. I'm going to just welcome everyone and give them a sense of who you are, but very briefly. I'm not going to read all your bios, but just briefly introduce you so we can get right to your discussion. And then I'll be out of the way. And then they're going to bring me back at the end, and I'll just thank everyone at the conclusion. But thanks to everyone for taking part in it. It's tremendous that we're able to do this. Well, hello, everyone. We're glad to welcome you to our panel discussion today. This is about a 30-second warning. We're going to let folks continue to log on and join our panelists here. So we'll get started in just about 30 seconds. So welcome to everyone to our intercollegiate panel with David Zucchino to discuss his book, Wilmington's Lie, and the connections of that story to some very important issues of our time. I'm David Nelson. I'm the president of Catawba College, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the discussion. Before I introduce our panelists and turn this over to them, I want to note that we will take questions toward the end of our time together, and we'll use the Q&A feature in Zoom. And you can type those in, and then we'll attend to those later in the discussion. So let me welcome David Zucchino to the Catawba campus. David has worked as a national and foreign correspondent. He's currently a contributing writer for the New York Times. We were noting earlier, you should pay careful attention to his recent work on Afghanistan in the Times. Among his many accomplishments, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 1989 for his series Being Black in South Africa. And his book, Wilmington's Lie, The Murderous Coup of 1889 and the Rise of White Supremacy, tells a story that is too little known, especially by North Carolinians. And that story is the point of departure for our conversation today. So David, we're glad that you're here, and joining David We're pleased to have students from higher education institutions around our community. I'm thrilled that we have folks from so many different campuses. So let me briefly introduce those students on the panel, and then we'll get to our discussion. Damola Ogunyomi is a student at Rowan Cabarrus Community College. Damola is she's active in service and leadership at RCCC, and she will soon complete her degree in nursing. So we welcome you to the discussion today. Andrea Garrido-Lecca is a senior studying politics here at Catawba College, while she's also minoring in environment and sustainability. And Andrea, like each member of the panel from Catawba, is a member of our Equity, Diversity, Justice, and Inclusion Task Force, the EDGI Task Force, as they're known around here, which is co-chaired by two of our faculty members, Dr. Shamara Sainer and Dr. Mercedes Quesada Embiid. Will McCorn is a student at Livingstone College, a founding member of the Student Senate there at Livingstone, and is a White House HBCU competitiveness scholar. Welcome to you, Will, and thank you for joining us. Jackson Chapin is a junior here at Catawba, majoring in mathematics and mathematical finance. And since he needs more to do, he's doing a double minor in computer science and data science, active here on campus. And as noted, he's also a part of our EDGI task force. And then Taylor Marshall is a senior here at Catawba College, majoring in environment and sustainability with a minor in business administration. She is a senator in our Student Government Association and is also part of our EDGI task force. I also want to say a note of thanks to faculty members, Mercedes Quesada Embiid and Andrew Jacobson, for helping to organize this event. We're thrilled to be able to do this. And as I noted, the story told in David's book, Wilmington's Lie, is too little known, especially by North Carolinians. It connects in some remarkable ways to current issues and events with respect to things like inequity, white supremacy, gerrymandering, and voting rights, among others. So once again, I'm glad to welcome David Zucchino to Catawba to help us with our panel discussion. David, welcome to you, and I'll turn it over to you and to the panelists at this time.
All right, thank you very much, David, and thank you, Andrew. I'm very happy to be here and very pleased that there's interest in what I think is a very important subject, not only historically, but as you pointed out, this incident reverberates to today. I will start out by, for the benefit of our guests, who probably many of them have not read the book, our panelists have, but I'll try to give you a brief outline of the major themes of the book, and then we'll go to the panel. This should take just a few minutes. On November 10th, 1898, at least 1,500 armed white men in Wilmington mounted the only armed overthrow of an elected government in American history. White vigilantes and white state militiamen killed at least 60 black men and drove more than 2,000 black citizens from the city. They evicted 10 city aldermen, the mayor, the police chief at gunpoint, and they installed the coup leaders in their place. They burned the city's black newspaper and tried to lynch the publisher. They banished black leaders who had survived the assault, as well as white, quote, race traitors who had served in government with black men. These men, white and black, were marched at gunpoint by the state militia to the train station in Wilmington, put on the train, and told them, "Don't ever come back. If you do, we will kill you." And not one of them ever returned, ever, even over the years. No one ever came back. None of those people. The coup cemented white supremacy as city and state policy for the next 60 years. It also turned a black majority city into a white supremacist citadel. In 1898, Wilmington was 56% black. Today, it's 18% black. After the coup, black citizens in North Carolina did not vote in any significant numbers for almost 70 years until the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Let me just give you a couple of numbers. In 1896, 2 years before the coup, there were 126,000 registered black voters in North Carolina, 126,000. By 1902, just 4 years after the coup, the number was down to 6,100. So you can see how effective they were in their goal of reducing the African-American vote. Now, in 1898, there was just one black man in Congress, in the House or the Senate, just one black man. He was George Henry White, who represented a district next to Wilmington. Now, after the coup, George Henry White was driven not only from office, but from his state by white supremacists. And after George Henry White stepped down, no Black citizens served in Congress from North Carolina until 1992. That's almost 100 years later. So again, this was a very effective move by the white supremacists. And after 3 Black aldermen were forced from office during the coup in 1898, no Black citizens served on the Wilmington City Council until 1972, more than 70 years later. Now, I suspect most of you have probably never heard of the Wilmington coup. And until I read about the centennial events in Wilmington in 1998, I had never heard of it either. And I went to high school and college in North Carolina, and not one textbook or professor ever mentioned Wilmington. Now, many people who've read this book have the same 2 questions I did when I first heard about the coup. One is, how did I not know about this? And secondly is, how could this happen in the United States of America? And my answer in part is, this is a buried chapter of American history that was covered up or mischaracterized for almost a century. And it happened at a time when white supremacy went unchallenged. Now, it's often said that visitors write history, and in this case, the white supremacist coup leaders indeed wrote the narrative of the coup, and they passed it down to the next generation of white supremacists in Wilmington and across the state. Now, they portrayed the coup as a, quote, good government initiative that replaced corrupt and incompetent Black leaders with honest white men. And they claimed it was Black men, not white supremacists, who were stockpiling weapons and planning a race riot. And they actually called the coup a race riot, a Black-inspired riot, rather than a violent act of domestic terrorism by armed white supremacists, which is what the coup was. And that's why this book is titled Wilmington's Lie, for the lie that stood for decades. Now, what truly shocked me about this event was that no one was ever held accountable. No one was arrested or charged, and the federal government did absolutely nothing. President McKinley was begged by leaders in North Carolina and in Washington to send troops to North Carolina, and I could find no record that he ever made one public comment about the coup. He did discuss it in cabinet meetings, but that was it. So no one was ever held accountable. Now, you might wonder why Wilmington was such a threat to white supremacists. Well, first, it was a Black majority city at a time when almost all major Southern cities had white majorities. And second, Wilmington was an outlier. It was a bold experiment in multiracial government 30 years after the Civil War. There was really no other city like Wilmington. Black men served in positions of authority. 10 of the 26 police officers were Black, so were 3 of the 10 city aldermen. There was a thriving Black middle class. There were Black magistrates, doctors, and lawyers. The county treasurer, the county jailer, the county coroner, and the federal customs collector at the Wilmington port were all Black men. Now, this was intolerable to white supremacists. They vowed to overthrow what they called, quote, Negro rule and, quote, Negro domination by the ballot or the bullet or both, and they did. Their goal, was not just to overthrow the multiracial government, but to deny Black men the right to vote or hold public office forever. Now, they had 2 main weapons, terror and disinformation. First, there were vigilantes known as red shirts, and these were successors to the Ku Klux Klan, as well as 2 state militias that were commanded and made up of white supremacists. They beat and intimidated Black men during the summer and fall of 1898. Their job was to ride out into the Cape Fear countryside and at night and yank Black men out of their homes, beat them and whip them, and tell them if they dared register to vote, they would come back and kill them. At the same time, white merchants in Wilmington, fired any Black men that they caught registering to vote. Secondly, there was a fake news campaign led by the News and Observer in Raleigh. And it was joined in by other white supremacist papers across the eastern part of the state, and particularly in Wilmington. This campaign portrayed Black men as rapists and as too primitive and uneducated to vote or hold public office. Now, you would think this major historical event would be described in detail in North Carolina's public history books. In fact, it was barely mentioned for years, and it finally was mentioned. It was characterized as an unfortunate but necessary, quote, good government initiative that removed corrupt and incompetent Black officials and replaced them with honest white men. Now, just to close, I want to read you from a few North Carolina public history textbooks from the 1940s. long before the lie in Wilmington was exposed. But these were state-sponsored textbooks that were read by high school students in the 40s. I'll read you 3 excerpts, and then we'll go on to the panel. The first is from a 1940 textbook, and remember, there could be, and I suspect there are, people alive today who studied this in high school. This, again, 1940. Quote, "The mass of Negroes became poor citizens. To keep their vote, the carpetbaggers and scalawags allowed them to do very much as they pleased. The worst crimes were not punished. The white people of the South were no longer safe." Here's from a 1949 textbook. Quote, "A number of blacks were jailed for starting a riot, and a new white administration took over Wilmington's government." That's it, no context. And finally, here's a 1940 textbook about the need by white people for the KKK and later the Red Shirts, which was the vigilante arm of the white supremacy movement. Quote, "To put an end to this terrible condition, white people joined together in a sort of club, which they named the Ku Klux Klan. Members dressed as ghosts and scared lawless men into acting decently. On moonlit nights, these men could be seen on horseback, riding to bring order back into the lives of their people. Such sights frightened Negroes into living better lives. The names of these men, Negro or white, who had done wrong were listed. The next moonlit night, the Klan would visit these men and punish them according to the wrongs they had done. After this, lawless men were not so bold and crime became less and less." So on that note, let's go to the panel.
So I would like to start, if I could.
Sure.
So you mentioned before how, why even as North Carolina natives, we haven't even heard this, let alone nationwide. It's this big event that no one, like, I've went to school all through North Carolina. I've never heard of this before in my life. And so I guess, why, just tapping into it again, why do, and this could be for you, David, or for everyone else to give in their own opinion, but why do we think that, we haven't heard of this as in North Carolina, let alone, it's a nationwide known event?
Right. I'll answer, and then I'll pass it to the rest of the panel. At first, the perpetrators of the coup bragged about it. They were very, very proud of it. The newspapers celebrated. There were celebrations in Raleigh and Wilmington where the Red Shirts rode in parades and they flew the Confederate flag and the bands played Dixie. There were big barbecues. So it was a huge celebration. And that generation, the leaders of the coup, wrote newspaper articles and memoirs and diaries and letters just celebrating this wonderful victory for white supremacy and finally vanquishing this threat of black men, and only men could vote at the time, black men voting in public, holding public office, which to them was a threat to their very way of life. Now, after this generation died out, they passed that same narrative down to the next generation, but eventually it was decided that this really was not something that Wilmington wanted to celebrate or wanted to mention, and it just got buried. They figured the best way to proceed was to pretend it never happened and just erase it from memory. And they were incredibly successful at doing that. Finally, the lie really wasn't exposed until 1951. There was a scholar at North Carolina Central University, an African-American scholar, who wrote a master's thesis that just punctuated the myth and told the story of what really happened. But even then, very few people had heard about this. In 2000, I think it was 2001, the state set up a commission to investigate the causes and the true nature of the coup. And 5 years later, they published a 400 and some page report. But again, I don't think it really reached public consciousness. And I've been going around speaking quite a bit since this book was published. In North Carolina, very few people have heard of this, and across the country, almost no one. So I think that might just set the parameters for you guys maybe to pick up. And I'd be really curious why you think you never heard about it, just like I never heard about it.
If you don't mind me chiming in, what I definitely heard, especially in your intro, David, was just how this was so intentional, right? How it was very strategic that, what was put in the textbooks, what was told, even through word of mouth, right? How it started off, with them bragging, and that lets the people in the surrounding areas know, hey, y'all, you Negroes, stay in your place. Talking about like the repercussions and how they did not vote these numbers from 126,000 to 6,100 Black voters. That is ridiculous. And so, it's very intentional that, and as you were saying about the Klan, how they instilled fear in people. And so, we haven't heard about it because everything that they did was to make sure that that fear was instilled, and then they act like it never happened. And so they can paint this picture that Black people don't vote, that they're not active, and completely ignore the fact that the reason that Black people have not been active or in this pocket are not active in the electoral process is because they have been pushed out of it intentionally. So that's what I think is the biggest thing, is just that we make sure that we understand that this didn't happen by accident. It's not happenstance. Everything that has been left out of history or put into history, saying erroneously, that was intentional.
Right. Let me just break in and we'll go on to the next person. Just one point I'd like to make is right after the coup, the white supremacist newspapers in Raleigh and in Wilmington said, Black people who we didn't kill and didn't run out of town are welcome to stay here as long as they know their place. And that was the exact phrase they used. So it was very clear they realized they had intimidated and terrorized these people and that they would stay in their place. And through no fault of their own, they were forced to stay in their place for decades. Anyway, anybody else?
Yes, I wanted to add to that. So in a course that I'm taking here at Catawba, it's called Media Culture and the Environment. And we're reading a book called I'm Right, You're an Idiot. And within that, we've been talking about the ways in which our public spaces have become polluted to the point that we become more gridlock with debates and things like that. And I feel like just from the way that these textbooks were written, it was a form of propaganda to confuse people, honestly. And when people are confused and they don't know what the truth is, they tend to start to tune it out if it becomes too much to, try and figure out how to understand. And you can even see that with, debates on the Confederate flag and what it actually represents and things like that. So yeah, it was very, the way the whole thing was set up, it was very intentional.
Anybody else?
And to add on to that, Taylor, I have a quite unique perspective. When I moved from Africa to America, I was just 10 years old and I started the school system in 5th grade. So that was when I was just recently being open to American history and learning about slavery and things of that sort. And I believe that if I had put myself in a box of just listening to the textbooks and education and not looking beyond that, I wouldn't have a renowned view of things like I do now. I think beyond what has been mentioned, it's easy to want to ignore the bad part of history because it's hard to talk about. It makes us uncomfortable. But I think people just really need to recognize that uncomfortableness is just that you are learning. It means that you're learning. It means that you are, your mind is being provoked. There's something that needs to be learned there. And I also wanted to add in that the importance of this question kind of points to the significance of education. When reading this book and realizing how far back all these themes and notions and ideas were back into the history, it's hard not to believe that there are people out there who are accustomed to this view of their truth, who don't think that this is exactly what it is and this is how it's been going on. They grew up in families that believe this. So I think it plays a huge role to what people believe today and why people act the way they do today.
I have one more thing I kind of want to say. It also opens up more questions to be asked. So even if, the government or the nation knew about this event, would it still be talked about? What do you think it would even be talked about now, even if we did know about it? And to be honest, I don't think it would. I mean, it wouldn't, I don't know. Something about it is, my heart of hearts, it won't be displayed. And it's unfortunate because this event is so monumental in the city of Wilmington, and we don't hear about that. You know, it's the first successful coup in American history. What, and it's not even heard of, but that's just part of what happened. So I don't know. It brings up many other questions to be answered.
I just want to say to that, Jackson, like I 100% agree with you. Unless we do it, you know what I'm saying? Like it's got to be us. It's got to be, and we see it. You know what I'm saying? Social media is our vehicle. You know what I'm saying? So like I'm seeing more and more people waking up and seeing and understanding, you know what I'm saying, about the push bombing and Black Wall Street and, you know, all these atrocities that have been buried for years. And because of social media, because our people are like thirsty for knowledge, you know, they're going out and trying to find it, like and disperse it and, you know what I'm saying, make sure that everybody has it. I think that's like our what we have to do. You know what I mean? Like, so I 100% agree. Like if we leave it up to them, nobody's gonna know. But if we take the power in our hands and are like, look, we're gonna take this information and give it to the masses, then man, we can make sure that this don't happen again. Because January 6th was almost that, you know.
It's like the old saying goes, "You're the change you want to see." So.
Before we continue to the next question, I would like to encourage attendees to utilize the Q&A section so that we don't miss your questions in the chat. Thank you. I think we can move on to Damola with your question, if you're ready.
Yes, I was trying to unmute. And this question is open to all panelists. When reading the book, what historical and present day themes seem parallel, and how have those manifested into forms of oppression that are widely accepted and keep the country and keep society from truly changing?
Yeah, I mean, we really live in a layered society now, by race and by class, beginning from the moment that Black men got the vote after the Civil War. White supremacists fought as hard as they could to keep them from voting and exercising their constitutional rights. They honestly and sincerely believed that Black men were not capable of voting, weren't intelligent enough, and did not deserve to be equal citizens, despite the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed after the war. Immediately after Black men got the vote in North Carolina and many other southern states, immediately passed Black codes that basically reduced African Americans back to the state of slavery. It controlled how they could work, where their children went to school, where they could live, who they could marry. And those restrictions aren't written down anymore, but they still carry through to today. I mean, just look at the police. And in researching this book, I found out that the first police forces were formed to catch runaway slaves. And police were very, very active in enforcing Jim Crow laws later after the coup. So this is really embedded in our society, and it carries through today in all walks of life, in education, in housing, in healthcare. We're seeing now with the COVID crisis, who gets most adversely affected by it, and who is less likely to get good and proper treatment. So this is just a fundamental part of our society. And today in North Carolina, we have white conservatives in the state legislature. And by the way, I believe the entire Republican delegation in the state legislature is 100% white, and it's mostly male. They're very conservative. I mean, they are not violent and overtly racist like the white politicians who ran the state back in 1898. But they really have some of the same goals, and one is to suppress the African American vote. Whether this is racist or political, I can't say. I don't know what's in their hearts. But if you're African American and you've been fighting these attempts for decades to keep you from voting, I don't think it really matters. They are in 2000, I think it was 13, when North Carolina tried to pass a voter ID bill. The conservatives, the Republicans, went to the state motor vehicles and asked who has a driver's license. And then he went to the voting bureau and said, when do African Americans vote? Do they like to vote on Sundays and souls to the polls? And their legislation was directed to cut off those avenues specifically. And a federal court threw out the voter ID bill, and one of the judges said that it targeted African Americans with surgical precision. The Supreme Court upheld it. But that was a blatant attempt to try to suppress the African American vote. The other thing that's still used today is gerrymandering. In North Carolina, these white conservatives in the state legislature have gerrymandered 28 legislative districts and 2 congressional districts. What they do is cram all the African American voters into one district to dilute their vote elsewhere and make all the other districts safe for Republicans. And again, the federal courts struck down these gerrymanders as unconstitutional racial gerrymanders in violation of the 14th Amendment. One of the judges who threw this out said that race was the paramount concern in drawing these boundaries. So you see 120 years later, the same goal is there, is to suppress the vote. You see this in Georgia today and the legislation that they're passing. So this, I think, is really embedded and baked into our government and into our society. Let's open it up for anybody else with their thoughts, because this is a huge subject.
Well, I kind of just want to add something to further extend it to the panel. And this was something I kind of, lightly touched on before, but how this is very similar to what we saw on January 6th. So like kind of speaking more toward like, ideology, what do you guys think? Like, how similar is this, the Wilmington coup and, January 6th?
Would you like me to start, Will?
Anybody.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've talked a lot about this and written a lot about this because there are some pretty striking parallels. One is the use of disinformation. I talked about earlier the propaganda campaign that was used in 1898. Well, on January 6th, it was the big lie by Trump and the Republicans that the election was stolen and that we have to take action. The other thing was the stolen election. In 1898, part of the motivation of the white supremacists, they claimed that the election that put these African Americans into office was fraudulent, and that teenage Black men were voting, and that there was all this really orchestrated fraud on the part of Black voters. And we see that again today, the same theme, that there is fraud and we have to stop it. The other thing was that in both cases, they equated vigilantism to patriotism. Both times. In 1898, whites were told that their very way of life was under threat because Black men could vote and hold office, and the whites would no longer control things the way they always had. So that was an existential threat. In 2000, on January 6th, Trump told his followers that their way of life was being threatened, that people were trying to take their country away from them, and that he didn't say this, but he implied that vigilantism and violence was okay in pursuit of patriotism. And he framed this as a patriotic cause. And his message for 4 years was that, and he didn't say it, but it was very clear that this is a white Christian country. That's who founded this country. And we were under threat by replacement theory, that pretty soon the whites are going to be the minority, and people of color and of other religions are going to outnumber us. And that has terrified white voters. And there's this really solid base that's been under the surface of resentment for years by whites of what's happening in our changing society. And Trump brought it out in January 6th, really put it out there. I mean, it was blatant. You saw the Confederate flags, you saw all the Christian white nationalism emblems. So really nothing much has changed. And the other thing that's really similar is the demagogues, the demagogic leader in 1898. It was Colonel Waddell, who was the former Confederate officer, was an incredibly dynamic and mesmerizing speaker. It can really incite white men to violently attack Black men. And January 6th, Trump, for all his faults, is a very charismatic speaker and very effective and knows how to play on the insecurities and the fears of white voters who feel they are going to be replaced. And that's what brought us to January 6th. So I'm really interested in what the rest of you think.
To add on to David's point about the leaders, I think another parallel is definitely the insufficient political leaders that may denounce the violence that happens, but not exactly the motives or ideology that we were talking about. Like how you mentioned President McKinley didn't do anything about the coup, even though he was warned multiple times about it, and how Trump didn't condemn white supremacists various times throughout his presidency. So like when an important figure acts like that, it only kind of ignites that white rage and resentment that's been building for years.
And Andre, I think that's actually like a kind of a really good segue into, what we're going into next, because we know that David has a lot of experience, both here and overseas as, a correspondent. And I really want to kind of, see what are some of the, once again, talking about the parallels, right? How has the way that you've covered, things overseas, of course, we know about your Pulitzer winning series, Being Black in South Africa, and then also your work in Afghanistan. So how has that kind of informed how you wrote Wilmington's Lie, and even how you, kind of look at the American condition, especially for, folks who have been disenfranchised?
Yeah. I was able to see how racism and tribalism and oppression and violence play out in different countries. I mean, but the themes are the same. It's just the tactics. Now in South Africa, they actually wrote down the apartheid laws. It wasn't subtle at all. They, in 1948, when the National Party took power, they wrote a series of laws that created apartheid, which means separateness. And clearly, Black Africans were inferior and they were separate by law. They could tell them where to live, what jobs they could take, who they could marry, where they could go to school, and it was all written down. Now, in the United States, it wasn't quite that blatant. I mean, no Jim Crow laws ever said, this law will keep Black men from voting. What they did was install poll taxes and literacy tests in whites-only primaries as a way to keep them, but they never formally said it. In South Africa, they laid it out. And I think part of that is because the whites were a minority, a small minority in South Africa. The second thing was the use of violence and the same phrases that Black Africans had to know their place and stay in their place, just as African Americans were told to do the same thing. And the apartheid regime used violence. They arrested people. They disappeared people. They created a whole legal code that made the most basic prosaic acts and turned them into crimes. In Afghanistan, it's a little different. The violence and oppression is based on religion and ethnic group. And that's been going on from the beginning of Afghanistan's history. And what makes Afghanistan a little bit unique from the United States or the South African example is that it's never been a coherent country. It is just a collection of ethnic groups all jostling for power. And there's no sense that we're all one people, we're all one nation, and we need to work together. And in the United States, I really fear we're losing that. We're losing that sense that we're all in this together and let's work together to make America better. And in fact, Trump has really just ripped that apart and put people in their opposing camps and really encouraged strife and hate and violence. Anybody else on that theme? I know we have two people who lived overseas.
Yes, I would say to add on to that, oppression exists everywhere. It can exist in the form of class, the family that you're from, where you are from, who you have connections with. I would say from my personal perspective, living in Africa, living in Nigeria, I would say it's more of a religion, tribalism kind of fight. I mean, you do see the same themes of maybe saying false news about a certain tribe in the papers and inciting fear and using that fear as a promotion of hatred. And I think that's kind of what you see hand in hand between what's going on in America and probably where I come from.
And to add on another like international perspective, in Peru, I know when the Fujimori government was in power, they often like targeted indigenous people just because they were indigenous. They associated them with being communist, even if they didn't have any affiliation with them. And I think we can see that happen here when like racial profiling happens and just like unjust arrests.
We also see it in these brutal attacks by police on African American men. Now, I will concede that the vast majority of police are honest and good, hardworking and do their jobs properly. But there is that really persistent minority of officers who I believe, as soon as they see a Black man, they assume he's violent, he's going to be angry, he's going to be disruptive, and he's probably a criminal, and he's probably on drugs. We saw this with Derek Chauvin. And what amazes me in these cases, it's almost always the police officer who instigates the violence and escalates the confrontation. All of these cases, there's such petty little, quote, crimes like selling loose cigarettes or a traffic stop, and it ends up in an African-American man getting killed. And this traces back, again, as I mentioned, police began as slave catchers, and they were enforcers of Jim Crow law. There were police officers who took part in lynchings and many others who stood by and let it happen. So I think this sense that African Americans aren't really citizens and that they are a danger and a threat really persists through a small minority of the police. And this has been going on for years. We're only hearing more about it now, obviously, because everyone carries a cell phone now and it's showing up video, but this was going on long before the video era.
And I would also like to include that, as you just brought up, police brutality and how white officers react to Black men, it's a really drastic contrast to what happened January 6th. There was a bunch of people who were willing to disrupt, our democratic processes, and nothing happened to them. Like, they weren't like arrested on site. They were able to get into the buildings. No one was, to my knowledge, no one was like immediately shot down as would if it were a group of Black people. So just that contrast is just, it was a slap in the face, honestly. Like, we are out there protesting to be able to live, and exist as humans. But when, other people, white people, are angry about something and they go out and do something drastically different in a violent manner, nothing seemingly happens.
Yeah, it really struck me at how accommodating just a few of the white Capitol police officers were. There was one guy who took the selfie smiling and grinning with a guy who had just broken into the Capitol. And there were a couple of videos that showed the police moving barricades and saying, come on in. So I think, again, there's that identification. Well, these are white men just like me. But if, as you said, imagine if that had been a Black Lives Matter protest, they would have been shot dead before they could have gotten close to the Capitol. I mean, I have no doubt about that. Senator Ron Johnson, the Republican from Wisconsin, had an interesting comment in a TV interview the other day. I don't know if you guys saw it. He said, I wasn't worried. I wasn't in threat of my life because he was in the Capitol that day, because these were good patriots. These were all great patriots. I wasn't threatened at all. And they were just expressing their First Amendment freedoms. And then he said, this was going to get me in trouble, but he said it anyway. Now, if it had been Black Lives Matter, I would have been threatened and it would have been a different situation. I mean, that's just astonishing that a senator would say something like that. But you really see it in the way the Republicans portray Black Lives Matter as thugs, as socialists, as violent. I don't know if you saw one of the political commercials during the 2016 campaign by the Republicans. It showed a white woman at home alone at night. She hears a noise. She calls 911, says, "Oh, I think there's an intruder in my house." And she gets a message that says, "Oh, I'm sorry, the police department has been defunded. Can you call back later?" I mean, that is a clear attempt to tell white voters. And Trump even said that they were coming to the suburbs, that they were going to take over. And by they, he meant the Black Lives Matter and African Americans, who in his mind are violent, they're thugs, they're criminals, and they're coming to your neighborhood. So you better vote for me. I mean, there's nothing subtle about the messaging.
I think we can move on to my question. So my question, I'd like to begin asking David, and then the rest of the panelists can answer. The white supremacists claimed that Black people are unable to govern. Historically, we have seen this idea influence America's actions, both domestically and in foreign interventions. In what other ways have we seen this quote used to justify imperialism and colonialism that has displaced many people of color, just how the coup forcibly decreased the Black population in Wilmington?
A perfect example is the summer of 1898 was the summer of the Spanish-American War, where U.S. forces fought indigenous people of color in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And the newspapers mounted an incredible propaganda campaign that was known as jingoism, to spread good American values to these uneducated, incapable people in these other countries. And it was just really a form of imperialism and colonialism, and it was celebrated. But the underlying message was, we know best, and the people in charge were white men. Our way of life is best, and we're going to impose it on these people who really need our help. And there was a lot of religious undertones to that too. Christianity can save these people, and that's been a theme of America's involvement overseas for many years. So I mean, that's just one example that happened just coincidentally with the coup of 1898. Anybody else?
Yeah, I definitely would like to highlight, I guess, just the fact that we still very much see this. I mean, we saw it, with Stacey Abrams. We saw it even with, President Obama. Just this constant, undermining of people of color, once they get into office, and trying to make them out to be, that they cannot do their jobs when we know that's not the case. So, once again, I think one of the biggest takeaways that I like everyone, on the call to, really see is just how many parallels there are. And, how, this is not far off from what could happen today. The conditions are similar. The ideologies are similar. So, yeah, I really dig this question that you came up with, Andrea. Really good stuff.
I'm going to just add one thing. You remember, I think it was last summer, you talked about delegitimizing people. Well, when Barack Obama was elected, that was the beginning of this undercurrent of white rage and resentment came to the surface because this is the first African-American president, and that was a huge threat to these people. And immediately they tried to delegitimize him by saying he was born in Kenya and he's a Muslim, so by virtue of that, he is not a true American, and he has no right to be president of the United States. That was the clear message. And then obviously Trump, in 2015, you remember when he came down that escalator, he said, Mexican, he was talking about immigration. He said Mexicans were rapists. He used that term. And that was just an echo of what whites were told in 1898. They said Black men were coming to rape your women and take your jobs. And the other thing Trump said is these Mexicans and these immigrants are coming to take your jobs. And finally, if you remember, I think it was last summer, when he told three congresswomen of color to stop complaining and go back to their home countries. The clear implication was, you are not really Americans and you should go back home and fix the problems there and don't complain about the United States. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt, but does anyone else have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to add on to that. I would like to propose this analysis. You mentioned white supremacy. So, of course, we can't really get into the minds of people and really know what they're thinking. But I've kind of noticed that throughout history, the definition of being a Black person or a person of color has changed from being somebody who's less than human and not up to a common standard. And from a quote in the book, it said poor, ignorant, illiterate. So now people of color can be seen as leaders, business people, people worthy of respect, people who should and deserve equal rights. And we can go as far as to say that in the eyes of some people, the value of being a person of color has gone up, and which affects their value. So all progress and advancements by people of color is then perceived as not something that's supposed to happen or a mere natural thing that's supposed to occur, but as a threat to the very core of their identity.
Yeah. You have to wonder, are they considered aberrations? Well, yeah, a few can make it, but the rest just aren't capable, and basically blaming the victim for the situation that's been created all these years. I mean, that's just one thought.
I was thinking something else also could be mentioned was the travel ban. The travel ban from some countries in the Middle East that Trump instilled, basically because he essentially didn't want them here. And it's hard for me to like formulate words because it makes me so angry thinking about it. But it's things like that cause turmoil, and it creates so many things so much dissonance with everyone. And America preaches this, oh, we accept everyone, for here for freedom.
Mm-hmm.
But then you won't allow people who are trying to escape turmoil in their home countries to come here,
right,
and experience the freedom.
Yeah, I mean,
it just doesn't make any sense.
Sorry, that shows you the effectiveness of demonizing and scapegoating people as the other. And in the case of the travel ban, Trump said it openly that Muslims are terrorists. That if they come into this country, we're going to have terrorism. And what he doesn't point out, there have been many, many more people killed by white nationalists and militiamen and white supremacists in this country since 2011 that were killed by Muslim terrorists is not even close. But nobody talks about it. I mean, now that Biden's in office, we're hearing more about it. But as you recall, under Trump, all the focus was on Black Lives Matter and Antifa, calling out the National Guard and calling out special SWAT teams. I think it was to Portland, to beat people in the streets and throw them into unmarked vans. There's clearly that demonization and scapegoating that really plays on the fears and insecurities of these white voters who support Trump.
And I got to see it firsthand. During the Baltimore uprising after Freddie Gray's murder, I was in the streets and I saw how they militarized the police. I tell people this all the time, and it's something that you don't forget, but I can still hear the sound of boots behind me. You know what I mean? Like I can still feel that, I can still hear like the sonic cannons a couple blocks away. You know what I mean? And so you don't forget those types of things. And so that, is an attempt, and once again, at intimidation and fear, because it's like, you don't need that type of response to people who are protesting. You know what I mean? And then to see the stark contrast in, how they deal with people, in these uprisings, these democratic uprisings across the nation, and how they deal with an actual coup, an attempted coup, is just, it's infuriating. I'm gonna just say, like, I've, even after all of these years, when I see something like that, it's triggering, because it's like, I saw how, there were police with tanks, riding down the street, Baltimore City police with tanks. Like, these are city police, and then to see how on the other side, none of that is there for these people who have guns, are coming with bulletproof vests and assault rifles to the Capitol, and they get nothing. They get people opening up the gate and swinging it for them to just saunter through. It's sick, man. It's sick. And I just hope that we can do better.
That leads me into my question, actually. It's kind of twofold. So this is more directed towards David, and I just want to know how writing this book has affected you personally and, made you into a more well-rounded person and more self-aware of, your place in the world, as well as how, and this is for everybody, how can we move forward after learning the truth of this? Because I see that when we find out something new about a way in which Black people have been oppressed and murdered senselessly, it kind of makes us push away and not want to have these discussions and not want to work with the people related to the oppressors and things like that. And we end up, separating further and not being able to come together and learn from each other and learn how we can, collaborate and figure out ways to make our world more just, and just also figuring out how to empower our youth to get into, fighting for their rights and things like that.
Yeah, for me, this was a real eye-opening experience. I mean, I thought I knew generally the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction and Jim Crow and all of that, but I had no idea how pervasive and how embedded racism is in our society. While I was researching this book, I realized this wasn't just happening in North Carolina and in Wilmington. It was going on throughout the South. It was Wilmington just happened to be the most successful example, but there were vigilantes. They were known as rifle clubs in South Carolina and red shirts in North Carolina, and of course the Klan. This movement from the moment Black men got the vote to crush them and to dehumanize them, to keep them at that level of slavery and at least second-class citizens. And I just didn't realize just how thorough and planned and complete it was. We talked about the coup. I think Will mentioned that how well planned it was. I mean, it was premeditated. And the interesting thing is that they announced it beforehand. They said what they were going to do, and that got the national press there. They wanted to see what they called the race war. So the fact that they could openly advocate a coup and murder and be accepted and celebrated is astonishing. And that really brought home to me just how baked in racism is in our society. I mean, beginning with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which was completely dominated by white men, and mostly white men of means and property, with no mention of anyone else. And we're still at the point today where you've got this tiered society where people are in different levels. And it really made me think about when I read about redlining, keeping Black citizens out of certain neighborhoods, the school segregation that went on for decades and is still really going on today by virtue of the fact that schools are based on neighborhoods, and our neighborhoods are so segregated still today, not by law, but by custom and in reality. So it puts all these things in perspective for me. And at the same time, it really, really brought home to me how, as a white person and a white male particularly, you can lead a very privileged life and not even realize it because you are given the benefit of the doubt. When I went out looking for my first job, it was all white men who were interviewing me. And I'm sure they looked at me and saying, oh, well, this is a white guy, middle class. He's got to be from a good family. And I'm sure he's intelligent and can do the job. And African Americans don't get that same consideration. I think in a lot of cases, white people doing the hiring to this day just say, oh, he or she is going to be a troublemaker. They may not be up to the job. I don't know if they really had a good education. And for me, it just made me realize, all my life, I had a head start. over a lot of other people and didn't even realize it. I would really love to hear your guys' life experiences as well, because I'm sure you've really experienced this to much more degree than I have.
I kind of wanted to add on to Taylor's point about what we should do to move forward from this type of actions. And I think we should definitely do an intergenerational approach. Like, for example, I know David interviewed, I think, the grandson of Alex Manley, and he said his family didn't want to talk about the coup. Like, it took him a long time to know what actually happened. And I think it's because, like, these stories are so traumatizing and sensitive. Like, it's hard to actually understand the past. So if we want to move forward, we have to understand that past. And, like, we also have to be understanding of our elders' struggles and trauma to, like, truly make meaningful change and create solutions that aren't going to cause further damage to our communities.
And to answer or acknowledge your question, Mr. David, about sharing our personal experiences. I remember when I was just in my second year in the American school system as a kid in 6th grade, and it was a predominantly white school, it was a small school, and I was the only immigrant. I still spoke, I still had my accent, I was still trying to learn how to speak things in English well. And I remember a certain incident where I was called into the office by the principal and I was told that I stole money. Were you raised by good parents? Did your parents teach you how not to steal stuff? Did your parents raise you well? And those were questions that really broke my heart, because first of all, I was in 6th grade. I didn't even know anything about the store, how to do a dollar. I didn't know anything about that. So why would I steal? And was later found that the janitor picked it up, but I never got called back to say, we're sorry. And a whole school basically alienated me as the bad person, as the person who, was, a thief or somebody like that. And it was so bad to the point where I had to move schools. And I think that when certain situations that occur, people of other races don't realize how deeply it can affect people of color, because for me, that was a significant event for me that I would take on with me in my life. But I don't take it on as something, as a point of negativity. I take it on as a point of hope of how I want to move forward. And I think to answer the question of how we can move forward, I think we have to understand certain basic principles. When no one is responsible for the existence of racism, then nobody is responsible for reforming it. We are all responsible for social change. Racism is not a problem that is partisan. It's a moral issue. And I also want to add in that when we talk about systemic racism, it doesn't always equal, okay, the system was full of racists, because when you believe that, then everybody is quick to turn a blind eye and say, well, I'm not racist, so I'm not part of the problem. And we're not really addressing the core issues. Systemic racism means that racist laws, policies, ideals have been so embedded in the American culture, history, and laws that we accept it. It's widely accepted now, and we choose, and society chooses to either ignore the problem, minimize it, or deny that it happens. So I think from here is to just listen and respect the experiences of oppressed groups, to take action, sign petitions, get educated, and educate people. I think I really believe in educating people, because I find that for myself, I had to be educated to be able to have the stance and be able to have the opinion that I do now, in addition to the experiences that I had. You have to stand up for what is right. When you see acts of racism, microaggressions, say something, and also promote diversity, whether in school, workplace, community. When you see it's not going on, something that's not going on right, you have to say something. And lastly, just realize that a little bit goes a long way. And we say that so much that it seems like a cliche right now, but it really is true. Your small action is motivating and promoting a whole movement of positive change. And those are things that I think we have to understand and apply.
Preach. I guess I'll take it next. Although I don't know how I'm about to follow that up because you definitely said something right there. Oh man, but I definitely agree with all of that. I think that the way that we look at systemic racism and institutional racism has to shift. We have to understand that like it's the system that's more at fault, but the system is comprised of us. You know what I mean? So it's like we need to shift these systems. All right, we need to break down these systems. Personally, I'm a believer in abolition. I believe that the carceral system needs to be abolished. I believe that the criminal justice system needs to be abolished and rebuilt from the ground up. Because we know that police were started as slave catchers, I don't expect them to do anything different. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't expect them to act differently because that was their original purpose, right? And that purpose has simply evolved. It has not changed. It's simply evolved. So I believe that we need to take a long and hard look at all of these different tiers and these tenets that make up the American society and see, well, what of these things were built upon rotten foundations, right? If it was built upon a rotten foundation, we need to uproot the entire thing and rebuild it. And of course, that's a process. It's not something that says like we're going to immediately defund all cops. We're going to immediately abolish all cops. It's over decades. But if we don't have a plan, then we'll never get to that point. So I think abolition is the ultimate goal. We want to live in a society where there aren't police. We want to live in a society where there are not prisons. But we have to do a lot of work to get there. So if we decide that that's going to be our goal, then, I think that we set goals and we set, 5-year and 10-year goals to where we can move toward that and really get to a point where, these systems are not ruling our lives anymore, essentially.
Thank you so much for all of your responses. I want to start taking the time to go to our Q&A and see what our attendees have for us to answer further. First one from Greg Alcorn. He says that Wilmington was named the first heritage city in the United States. I was surprised there was not a protest because of 1898 and the Wilmington Tent. Why was there not a protest?
That's a good question. I wasn't aware of that. I do know that since 1998, the leadership in Wilmington, and particularly at UNC Wilmington, has tried to bring Blacks and whites together to really talk about what happened and talk about the long-term consequences for Blacks and whites. And that's been somewhat successful. But there is still, as you can imagine, a lot of pain and sorrow in the African-American community because they have never gotten back to where they were. The Black middle class was decimated, it has not really come back. The professional class is not there. They don't have the economic power that they used to have, and nothing close to what the whites have. And the whites benefited from what happened in 1898. I mean, they built their lives and careers based on the violence and the dislocation of 1898. So this is something Wilmington still struggles with. They did put up a memorial to the victims, and in the historical plaques that go with it, they did reframe the narrative and told the true narrative of what happened rather than calling it a race riot. They explained what really happened and talked about particularly the effect on voting rights.
And I would also like to comment on that. I feel like there wasn't much talk of a protest because there wasn't anyone to really lead the people. It seemed to be a really scary time. And I mean, as far as I can remember or to my own awareness, I feel like protesting didn't really start until people like MLK and Malcolm X started popping up. So just the lack of, the Black community's ability to come together and protest, it just wasn't an option, especially since, that really traumatic experience just happened. So who's to say that they wouldn't get shot down in that moment as well? So I think there was a lot of fear behind it that kept people from protesting, close to when that occurred. But let's move on. So Susan Lee says, what lies have been told and continue to be told about Jim Crow era statutes and their relation to state-sanctioned racial terrorism during Jim Crow?
I would say is the fact that, well, that was a long time ago and that doesn't exist now, and that's just not true. I mean, the impacts of that are being felt today. There are people alive today, and I've interviewed some of them that were forced to take literacy tests. They were forced to do things like recite the preamble to the Constitution from memory. And we forget that up until probably the 50s and the 60s in the South and in North Carolina particularly, the registrars, the people that controlled who got to vote, were all white men, and they could individually just disqualify Black voters for no reason. So this is still going on today. Look at the legislation that just passed in Georgia. It took the authority for elections away from the Secretary of State, who in this case was a Republican, but they took it away from him because he stood up to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump tried to get him to subvert the election and commit election fraud. But now it gives the state legislature, which obviously is white and Republican, the power to appoint who controls the elections and who decides, who gets to vote. Was the election valid? So now it's set up where the Republicans can appoint their own people to the commission, and that commission can invalidate any vote they want. They can overturn the entire vote. And this was only done because Joe Biden won Georgia and the Democrats won those two Senate runoffs. I really don't believe any of this would have happened if Republicans had won as usual. I mean, that's just one example of how Jim Crow and the attempts to reduce the Black vote are very much in play today.
Did anyone else want to comment? If not, I'll move on. So the next one, it's actually a really good question. When talking with someone about systemic racism who does not get it but wants to understand, how do you share this story and make it relevant to where we are today? And this can be for anyone.
Anybody else want to try that one?
I think we can kind of say, like, I think you just draw the parallels, you just kind of outline, like this lines up with that, we see the demagoguery, we see the manipulation of media, you know what I mean? Like, and I think that helps. And then also the way that you explained it, David, I think was really good. And I do want to, like give you some props, man, because there are a lot of people that look like you that are in your age range that do not get it at all. And are obstinate, about, not trying to get it. And so I appreciate that, you're willing to evolve, and as you're presented with more information that, to move forward. So I think, the way that you, showed it is like, hey, look, I've had a leg up my entire life, even though I did not have a perfect life. I still had more opportunity than someone who might have had a darker skin tone, you know what I'm saying? So I think that's a good way to put it, and a good way to get through to someone who does not get it.
I would also like to add, simply having conversations with people of color. I think that, of course, it can be very uncomfortable, but like Damola said, uncomfortability is necessary in order for us to learn and grow together, and figure out ways to, be able to find the similarities between us. Just by having a conversation that will unite us to be able to, move forward together. And I mean, people will have a lot of stories to tell on how they've been discriminated against. Just like, for an example, within the workplace, there could be policies put in place for people of color not to be able to wear their natural hair. I know that, I'm not sure how far back, but if I were to apply for, a position where I'm working in an office, I wouldn't be able to get the position just because of how my hair is. People don't think that locks can be, they think they're unprofessional when they're really not. depending on who you're talking to, having locks is like a form of liberation and freedom and self-expression. It's not inappropriate, it's not unprofessional, but that's the reality that we have to face. And even with applying for jobs, it's sad to admit this, but sometimes I'm afraid to state that I'm a Black woman, because I know that, I assume that the person on the other side might already be biased towards me because of that. So yeah, just having more dialogue with people. Don't be afraid to ask questions, especially if you're, genuine with your questions, and want to learn more about ways in which you can educate other people about what's going on and how we can move forward together. Did anyone else want to chime in?
Just want to throw in what you're talking about, the Crown Act. They just passed legislation that you can't discriminate in the workplace. So like that's major. So yeah, I think y'all on it.
Thank you. Samoa, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to add on that I'm a firm believer that education is truly important to be able to, expand your knowledge and your perspective across many, groups and people. And I would just like to say for anyone out there that's that's wanting to be educated, recognize that you're going to make mistakes, but understand that as an approach to learning more. Understand that as a place that you just need to learn more, that you just need to have more conversations, that you need to be more open-minded, and be able to take that information and apply it and do what you're supposed to do and do what is right. So I just wanted to add that in.
Thank you for your responses. I'm gonna quickly go through 2 or 3 more questions since we're short on time now. But one person says, was the coup in Wilmington the only of its type, or are there more of these stories across the US that have yet been identified?
It was, to my knowledge, the only armed overthrow of an elected government, but there have been many, many so-called race riots in America, and there have been many attempts to drive Black people from office and to keep them from voting. I mean, Tulsa is the perfect example of whites suddenly rising up and destroying an entire Black community and murdering Black people in the streets as they did in Wilmington. I think what was unique about Wilmington was it was premeditated and planned months in advance. And almost all of these other so-called race riots in Atlanta and Chicago and Tulsa were more spontaneous. And the spark was interaction between a Black man and a white woman. It was in the elevator between a Black man and a white woman in Tulsa. So Wilmington in that regard was unique, but it certainly by no means was the only example of white supremacists resorting to violence to keep African Americans, quote, in their place.
Thank you for that response. And to close us out, what advice would you give to younger generations today for actions that can make a difference and change the current systems when history shows we are dealing with essentially the same sort of issues for hundreds of years?
Well, I'm going to pass this to the young people right here on this panel. Go ahead.
I would like to say something. It ties back into what Damola was saying about, change in education are uncomfortable, but it's what needs to happen. You're the change you want to see, and it's just about educating yourself, educating everyone around you, and being the voice for people who don't have one. For someone like me, as a white man, as a white person, the privilege I have, I want to use to help promote the voices of those who don't have it, who might not, or who are underrepresented. And that's something that I think every person who has the privilege needs to do with their voice. It's very, very important to me, and very, very important to a lot of people that you use your voice to promote and help others.
I would also like to add that we, I think people would think this is like a given, but I don't think we really know how to talk to each other anymore. In my media culture and environment class, we were talking about how people, when we get into debates, we tend to um, go at it from basically giving monologues and stating our truths in our cases and things like that. And we tend to zone out the other party until they say something that goes against our own truths. And then we end up attacking their character instead of what's actually being said in the topic at hand. So I think as we move further in trying to, also uplift the younger generation's voices, we need to remind ourselves that, it's greater than us. We need to, you know, accept other people's truths and different experiences, because that's what makes us unique, and it doesn't have to divide us. It can be a beautiful thing to have different perspectives, which can lead to creative ways to, collaborate and come up with different policies that, makes things more inclusive and gives people more opportunities to thrive in life. So thank you all so much for all of your responses. Thank you to the attendees. I will pass it off to David Nelson as he closes us out. Thank you.
Can you all hear me, Taylor?
Yes.
Yeah, for some reason it's not letting me start video, but that's perfectly fine. Let me just say thanks to everyone who stopped by over lunch to chat with us and to hear the panel discussion. And I just pause for a moment and think about what we've heard as we've thought about a story from a long time ago and the similarities to what we see today. Words like misinformation and propaganda and lies and erasure and demagoguery, voter suppression, gerrymandering. I could go on and on. And we've heard some really good reminders from our students about the importance that we continue to learn. And I could not help but note, David, how carefully you do your work, and you continually referenced voter suppression, and you mentioned Black men. Let's just note that it was not until some years later that women even had the right to vote, which is another matter, but it's just worth noting that this is the system that we all live in. It is our nation. And you've already given us really good advice about what to do. And I assume people tuned in because they want to know about this, they're interested, but everyone surely is wondering, what can I do? And you've already heard good advice. Let me just remind you the power of acknowledgement, just acknowledging that these are truths. This is our history. So often these horrible events happen and I hear people say, well, that's just not who we are. Let's admit it is who we are. That's why it keeps happening, because it's who we are. So we have to come to terms with that and acknowledge it. David, you've done a beautiful job in your work of doing that. And thank you for that. And part of that acknowledgement is to say, yeah, systemic racism, that's a thing. That's a real thing. And that's not a partisan comment, or that's just a thing. That's just a fact. And we want to replace it with systemic equity. We want to be for everyone. And just like Jackson said, if you look like me, you look like David, use your voice to advocate for the change. And then I think if you want to know what you could do today, Taylor just wonderfully reminded us what others have said. Listen to one another. Have a conversation with someone that's different than you are. Listen to one another. And then as Andrea said so beautifully, there's a lot of pain and sorrow and hurt and trauma in all of this. And so as you listen, love one another and take care of one another. And if we do that, we'll all be in a better place. So David, thank you for your work, for your reporting. I'm going to plug again, people should be reading your work in the Times. It's really important work about some really hard matters right now that we all need to know about. And then thank you to our students, to Damola and to Will and Taylor and Jackson and Andrea. Thank you for being a part of the dialogue, for being so very thoughtful. And I want to say, you know, David and I, we look like what we look like. We've got the white hair or less hair or all of that. You don't know how much hope you give us to hear young people like you dialoguing the way you are and caring for the world the way that you do. You're the kind of people that are going to make the world more like the place we all want to live. So thanks for inspiring us today. We really do appreciate it. So to all who dialed in, thanks so very much. We hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.